Well, thank you for joining me again in the study in the book of Nehemiah. And we're moving on this evening to the 5th chapter of this wonderful book. God using one of his servants, having raised him up and leading others in the work of God. So we're going to begin the study, and I want to introduce the study by just speaking a little bit about my family. And I have 2 daughters, and all my children at this stage have moved out of the home, got married or studying. But I do remember the days when the 2 daughters loved to bake cakes. And they would experiment, they would do different things, but we all of us in the family enjoyed the fact that they loved baking. And we'd try all sorts of experiments and recipes, and we would enjoy the fruit of their labor. I still remember some of them favorites, some chocolate bars, chocolate chip cookies, and even chocolate cake. So it would be true to say that in all of their baking efforts, there were the occasional times when a cake flopped. It didn't work. The outcome wasn't as they expected or anticipated. And sometimes something goes wrong, and a cake flops, and it doesn't work out. It doesn't taste so good. And anybody who is a baker will know that the reason is that they probably missed an ingredient. Maybe in a hurry, reading the recipe, leaving off something that was essential, and then the outcome is not what they desired. Now, it's not such a big deal if you leave certain things out of a recipe. So if you put nuts in the cake, or you don't put nuts in the cake, I guess it doesn't really matter. If you have chocolate chips or you don't have chocolate chips, it doesn't really matter. But there are certain ingredients that are absolutely essential. Now, I'm no baker, but for the sake of this illustration, there are certain ingredients that if you leave them off, your cake will be a flop or your cake will be a success. And I'm guessing something like baking powder. If you don't have baking powder within the recipe, you're going to end up with a cake that is a flop. Well, as we turn to Nehemiah chapter 5, and something of what we're going to try and see from this passage, what God is saying to us, we see here that on the one hand, some what I'm going to call messy, sinful choices and actions by certain of the Jews, and on the other hand, there were some wholesome, godly choices and actions by Nehemiah and some of those people around him. In the first scenario, and this is going to be the real thrust of the study that we're going to pick up along the way, there is a certain important ingredient missing. Whereas in the second scenario, the ingredient is stirred into the heart and mind of Nehemiah. So let's go to the study, and we're going to look at the first point, and we're going to look at the people who make messy, sinful choices. Couldn't help thinking, my mind going back some years ago now, to a person in our city known as the Blade Runner. I won't mention his name, but you certainly will identify the person. There was a crisis. One morning we woke up to the news that he had shot his girlfriend. Now, whether he did that accidentally or deliberately after a heated lovers' argument, I don't want to enter into that. The courts did decide on that particular case, and he did end up going to prison. But the truth be said, and to use his life as an example, there were quite a few messy choices that emerged in the unfolding of the court case. The girlfriend that was shot was not the first. She was one of a string of women that he have living with him. And then not long before this particular instance, it was reported that he was in a drunken state. He smashed a speedboat onto a jetty at the Val Dam. And many people were saying, many people around him, and again, I don't know if this is just allegations or whether it's truth, that he was a man who was reckless with a gun. I use this illustration because it demonstrates to us this particular point that we're going to see in Nehemiah chapter 5. Here is a man who was living in the fast lane for himself. Everything seemed to be for himself. He was a man driven by instant gratification, even to the cost of others. It seemed, yes, that he had lots of money. He was very wealthy. He enjoyed a certain status within society and community, and that resulted in a certain arrogance that was conveyed in the broader context of things. And something is missing. There's something missing in this person's life. And he's not alone. He stands in the company of many, perhaps even many of us, as we are challenged by the word of God today. He certainly stands amongst what I would call the opportunistic Jews described in chapter 5 and verse 1 of Nehemiah. Have a look at that verse. Now there arose a great outcry of the people and of their wives against their Jewish brothers. And then the second verse goes on, just the first word, for, and the reasons are given. And the passage goes on to give us some detail of what these Jews were doing. They were making choices. They were involved in actions and life patterns that can be summed up with a simple phrase that I'm going to put up on the screen in our outline: exploiting others for selfish gain. Life in the city of Jerusalem had become difficult. It was hard. Their diligence, their hard work, and over the period of time on the rebuilding of the wall, and even after the rebuilding of the wall, did not exclude them from what we would call the troubles common to man. Famine in verse 3 is highlighted. This resulted in food shortages affecting the economic livelihood of the citizens. Food had to be imported from the outside, had to be bought or had to be bought at higher prices from within the community. And some of the folk were desperate, and we read of this in verse 2. And speaking of these brothers, for there were those who said, with our sons and daughters we are many, so let us get grain that we may eat and keep alive. And then on top of that, in verse 4, on top of this, there were the king's taxes that had to be paid. Now, what do you do when you're desperate? I think many of us have been there. We don't have the resources that are needed, and we do what is necessary. I can remember seasons in my own life, accessing the bond, paying the bond at the end of the month, and the beginning of the next month, accessing the payment and just lifting the bond up and never paying a cent off the bond over a period of 15 years. I've been there. Just so that the family can survive, so that children's education and needs can be met. We do this kind of thing. I remember an occasion, and I'm sure some of you have done this, starting well in my early 20s and committing to retirement annuities. But along the way, there's the need to cash them in, to close them, to stop them, simply so that the family can survive. So it is a general pattern, and I understand that there are times in people's lives, and we certainly see this in the chapter in Nehemiah, where these people were desperate, and they had to do something to survive. And so their action, if we go to the passage and the ever-deepening crisis of desperateness, they were mortgaging their property in the 3rd verse. They borrowed money in the 4th verse. And even with that, they couldn't pay off their loans, ended up in default, having then to, listen to this, to sell off their children as slaves in verse 5. Now, these people are desperate. These people are helpless. Verse 5, it's not in our power to help it, for other men have our fields and our vineyards. It's tough to be in that kind of helpless situation. It's tougher in that kind of desperate, hopeless situation, and we see this in this passage, when your brothers are getting richer off the back of your poverty. And this is not unique to the situation in Nehemiah. This, I'm sad to say, is prevalent in so many places. In their context, their fellow Jews, their brothers, were exploiting the desperate citizens who just wanted to survive. Those with means, those who had resources, saw an opportunity to add to their already big bank balance by taking advantage of their brothers who had their back to the wall. So Nehemiah calls a spade a spade. He brings charges against these nobles and officials. In verse 7 he says, "You are exacting interest, each from his brother, and I held a great assembly against them." Perhaps in our context we could liken this exacting of interest to these micro-lending schemes that we see in our city, where many poor people are exploited with exorbitant interest rates and digging their hole of debt even deeper and deeper. Unreasonable interest rates are charged, and it results in really what is an impossible debt accumulation that cannot be repaid. Now, just to say that God back in Deuteronomy had given some clear guidelines in terms of how Israel should operate and how people should act toward each other in this regard. So in Deuteronomy 23 verse 19, "You shall not charge interest or loans to your brother, interest on money, interest on food, interest on anything that is lent for interest." We must be careful thinking that kind of thing doesn't happen today. And it's not just a question of money, but there are other instances, other circumstances where we are tempted and we can fall foul to exploit our brothers, exploit others for selfish gain. Apparent kindness, just being kind to someone to win them over to your way of thinking, but actually not having any particular interest in them. Taking advantage of somebody who is emotionally naive or immature to feed your own self, your sinful self-indulgent nature. It even happens, and by the way, we've seen this. I've seen this over the years. Somebody who suffered with dementia, and somebody comes along and get involved, and you can imagine the kind of advantage that can be taken either physically or even financially or materially. Sometimes it's when we just say something about somebody else to make them look bad and make us look good. So it's about a way of life that uses people as objects, using people for self-interest, for greed, for self-elevation, and those become the governing principles of these kind of people. And there is a missing ingredient, and I'm not going to get to the ingredient yet until a little bit later in the chapter, but I want you to see that people behave in this despicable, selfish way, this messy, sinful way, hurting their brothers, exploiting their brothers for selfish gain. Well, there is a second scenario, and we're going to move on to that. There are people who make wholesome, godly choices. The outcry of these exploited people, from these exploited people, reaches the ears of Nehemiah. And now what could he have done? He could have let the complaint fall on deaf ears. He could have let it pass him by, but he doesn't. He listens to their protest. And his initial response, and rightly so, is anger, and then also that of self-examinations. He counsels with himself in verse 6 and reaches a decision to confront these culprits publicly in verse 7 on the evil that they're doing. And he doesn't mince his words. Listen to verse 8. "We, as far as we are able, have bought back our Jewish brothers who have been sold to the nations, but you even sell your brothers that they may be sold to us." Verse 9. "The thing you are doing is not good." He goes on to call a halt to this practice. They must stop doing this thing in verse of exploitive interest in verse 10. And then he even goes a step further and he demands restitution be made in verse 11. And so the choices and actions of Nehemiah can be summed up, and again, just a simple phrase that I'm going to use: unusual generosity toward others. Something unusual and unexpected begins to happen. Nehemiah and his co-leaders decide to go out that which was their due for the sake of helping others. There's a bit of sacrifice here, sacrificial a way of life. Verse 14. Moreover, from the time I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year to the 32nd year of Artaxerxes the king, 12 years. 12 years, not just 1 week, not just 1 day, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allowance of the governor. Verse 15, the former governors who were before me laid heavy burdens on the people and took from them their daily ration, 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants lorded it over the people. We need to just see that digested a little. Unlike the leaders before them, Nehemiah and his co-leaders are prepared to go without their benefits to be generous towards those in need. That seems to me quite rare. But Nehemiah takes another step of great generosity. Have a look at verse 17. Moreover, there were at my table 150 men, Jews, officials, besides those who came to us from the nations that were around us. And what was prepared at my expense for each day was 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, birds, every 10 days, all kinds of wine in abundance. Yet for all this I did not demand the food allowance of the governor, because the service was too heavy on the people. Just unusual generosity. Now, it doesn't take a lot of insight to see that so much of this is a daily reality amongst political appointments in our circles, in our country, and even further afield. Huge financial gain being received by people in power, and even in an economy where there's desperation, where people are earning a pittance and people don't have adequate education facilities. In many instances, they don't even have decent toilets. Roads are falling apart, and politicians live in the lap of luxury and scheming with corruption. Even this morning, I was reading on News 24 the reality of what's going on in tenders being given to people who are incompetent in the world of PRASA. You see, this is what people do when they don't have this ingredient. More often than not, they will perpetuate their lavish lifestyles, exploiting the poorest of poor. It's normal. It's the pattern. We see it in the world around us. But now with Nehemiah, the leader, the governor, the reverse is happening. There's unusual generosity from this leader, Nehemiah, toward the citizens of Jerusalem. Now I want to go on, and I want to ask now 2 searching questions. And remember where we're going. We're trying to identify this, either this missing ingredient or this ingredient that is present. So what makes men or women sell their brothers and children off as slaves, willing to exploit their desperate situation for greedy, selfish self-enrichment? What makes a man do that? What makes a woman do that? That's the first question. Second question. What makes a man act unusually and unexpectedly generous toward others, even at a sacrifice or sacrificial cost to himself? What's the difference? What's the difference? And I want to go to the issue of baking a cake. Like baking a cake, the answer has everything to do with the essential ingredient. When the essential ingredient is absent, men and women act in ways that exploits and disregards others. They live for themselves. And in terms of what the real purpose for their lives would be, their lives are actually a flop. When the essential ingredient is present, men and women will act in ways that are sacrificial and generous, lifting the burden that others have to carry. I think we could say in terms of God's purpose, their lives are wholesome. What is the essential ingredient? It's in the passage. I hope you picked it up in reading the passage in preparation. Verse 9. So I said, the thing that you're doing is not good. Ought you not to walk in the fear of the Lord, the fear of our God, to prevent the taunts of the nations and our enemies. Verse 15. The former governors who were before me laid heavy burdens on the people and took from them for their daily ration 40 shekels of silver. Even their servants lorded it over the people. But I did not do so because of the fear of God. Folk, if you know nothing of the fear of God in your life, your patterns, the patterns of your life, the habits, the decisions, the actions, the choices will mostly be for self. Number one, only number one counts. Your life will be characterized by greed, personal enrichment, even if it means disregarding others, even if it means exploiting others. Romans chapter 3 verse 18, Paul describing human dilemma of sinful nature. There is no fear of God before their eyes. If, however, you know something of the fear of God in your life, the patterns and the choices and the habits and the actions include something else, a way of life that honors God. Your life will be characterized by compassion and generosity toward others. Needy people will be within the scope of what you're able to do, materially, spiritually, and even in other things, willing to give to others. Well, for a cake not to flop, you do need to have the baking powder stirred into the cake mix. For your life and witness as a Christian to be pleasing to God, eradicating selfish greed and exploitation, a measure of the fear of God must be present. How do you know? How do you know if the fear of God is present in your life? You know by looking to see if, if your choices and actions and life patterns are driven by self-interest, or whether your choices and actions and patterns display generosity and compassion. Which leads me with the next point, and I've called it one important fact. Having the fear of God is always dependent on being in a conscious state of forgiveness of sin. So all of what I've been saying in this lesson today must be understood, and especially in terms of the solution of those of us who live understanding who God is and who we are. Something about the nature of God, and also something about the nature of man. Now, Psalm 130 helps us understand this one important fact that I want to speak to. Verse 1 gives us a clue to the context. The psalmist is in a state of dejection or despair, or desperation. Spiritually, he's in the depths of despair. And so he says, out of the depths I cried to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ear be attentive to the voice of my plea of mercy. Now, why is he crying out to God for mercy? Well, in verse 3, we see the depths are guilty and defiled. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? So you see the psalmist over here, he's understanding something of the greatness, the holiness. In fact, the holiness of God dominates, I think, in his mind at this particular point in time, understanding that there is the justice of God that flows, there is the wrath of God for those who do not conform to the holiness of God. And so there's an expression of the fear of dread. How on earth is he going to stand before God as someone who is a sinner, someone who makes sinful choices, somebody who's involved in sinful action, in the light of who God is, as holy and all-knowing and majestic, just and powerful? Lord, if you take note of my sin, how am I going to be able to stand in your presence? But then he gets to verse 4. But with you, there is forgiveness. And this forgiveness will bring the discoverer into the experience of the fear of God, not of dread, but of reverence and awe. Verse 4, that you may be feared, standing in awe and amazement before this God who gives that which is not deserved abundantly to those who are rebels and sinners. A discovery of God's forgiveness, giving to him, giving to us today as we come in the light of the work of Jesus, secures a fear of God. Why does that happen? It comes because forgiveness, generously given to rebellious, undeserving sinners on the basis of what Jesus did in the light of the glory and the majesty of the cross, you cannot avoid, you should not avoid the impact of this Jesus, the God-man, condescending in humiliation in his birth, life and death, and then the glory of his resurrection and ascension, and seeing that in the context for me. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. When you grasp, when you apprehend what Jesus has done for you, it brings you, yes, into the context of peace from the wrath of God, no condemnation to those in Christ Jesus. It removes the need for the fear and the dread of God, the wrath of God. But in its place, it produces the response, the inclination of reverence and honor and awe and glory and obedience for this mighty God. And so the question, just in closing, what sort of cake, if we could use the cake representing your life, what sort of cake are you baking with your life? Is it messy, greedy, and selfish? Then the challenge comes to you, do you actually know the forgiveness of sin? Do you know the reality of who God is and how desperately you actually stand and I stand in need of forgiveness? Is your life generous, full of unexpected and undeserving grace, filled with devotion and awe for God? God is honored and praised because you're generous toward others. And so may God help you and be with you as we move on, and do have some questions that can be considered if you're meeting in a group, and do trust that God will be with you, undertake for you in these coming days. May God show us much of the reality of the fear of God.